Sometimes the most beautiful chapters of our lives begin with the smallest, most ordinary moments. What started as a simple neighborly conversation would soon become something neither Carol nor Mark expected a journey that would change both their worlds in ways they never imagined. Life had found its way into a steady beat for Carol, day after day. The same routine played out like a familiar song. Predictable. Yes. Comfortable. Absolutely. But if she was truly honest with herself, maybe just a little too quiet for her liking. Her children had spread their wings and flown away to build their own lives. Phone calls came regularly. But the house that once buzzed with teenage laughter and morning chaos now held only the gentle hum of her computer and the soft tick of the kitchen clock. Working from home kept her busy during the day, fingers dancing across the keyboard, video calls filling her screen. But when evening came, the silence would settle in like an old friend, pleasant enough, but missing something she couldn't quite name. The nights would melt together in a comfortable, solitary rhythm. A cup of tea steaming beside her favorite chair, the television murmuring in the background. Sometimes a good book, sometimes just the peaceful quiet of her own thoughts. It was a good life, she told herself. Simple, safe, but somewhere deep down, a small voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, she was missing something important. Her neighbor Martha was like a burst of sunshine in comparison. That woman never seemed to sit still. Always outside with dirt under her fingernails from gardening, or hosting her book club where voices would drift over the fence in animated discussion about the latest novel. Martha was the kind of person who baked cookies for new neighbors and remembered everyone's birthday. It's a complete opposite to Carol's quieter way of living. They were friendly the way good neighbors should be. They'd chat over the fence while hanging laundry, borrowing a cup of sugar here and there, discussing the weather or Martha's prize roses that made everyone in the neighborhood secretly jealous. But their lives ran on completely different tracks, like trains heading to different destinations. So when Martha mentioned one afternoon, while they were both outside collecting mail, that her cousin was coming to stay for a while, Carol didn't think much of it. Okay, he's going through some changes, Martha had said, her voice carrying that careful tone people use when they don't want to share too much. Needs a place to figure things out. You know how it is. Carol nodded and smiled, thinking it was just another temporary face in the neighborhood's ever-changing cast of visitors. Martha was always helping someone, a friend's daughter between apartments, an old college roommate passing through town. It would probably be the same thing. A few days later, while Carol was watering her front garden in the late afternoon sun, she caught her first glimpse of him. He was across Martha's lawn, bent over near the flower beds, wrestling with what looked like a stubborn sprinkler head. All she could see was his back, tall and lean, wearing a simple t-shirt and jeans that had seen better days. His hair was dark with silver threads catching the light at his temples. It's a kind of natural gray that spoke of a man somewhere in his early 50s who had lived through enough seasons to earn those silver streaks. There was something about the way he moved, careful and deliberate, like someone who thought before he acted, when he finally turned around, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. Their eyes met across the space between their yards. It was just a moment, brief as a heartbeat, but something in his gaze stopped her mid-pour. Her watering can tilted, sending a small stream onto her shoes instead of the petunias. There was tiredness in his eyes, the kind that comes from carrying heavy thoughts for too long. But underneath that weariness, she saw something else. A gentleness that made her breath catch just a little. He offered a small, polite smile and a brief nod before turning back to his battle with the sprinkler. Nothing dramatic, nothing earth-shaking. Just two neighbors acknowledging each other across a stretch of grass. But for some reason, Carol found herself thinking about that moment as she finished her watering and went back inside. Martha made proper introductions later that afternoon when Carol was checking her mailbox. "Carol, I'd like you to meet my cousin Mark," she said, practically bouncing with the energy she brought to everything. "Mark, this is Carol. She lives right next door and she's absolutely wonderful." Mark stepped forward with an easy stride. extending his hand. His handshake was firm but not overwhelming, the grip of someone who understood the importance of a proper greeting. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into sunlight. Maybe working outdoors. "Nice to meet you properly," he said, his voice carrying a slight roughness, like he didn't use it for small talk very often. Not unfriendly, just ... careful. Reserved, like someone who had learned to keep his thoughts close to his chest. "Likewise," Carol replied, noting how his eyes seemed to take in details the small wind chime hanging from her porch, the carefully tended flower boxes, the book she'd left on her front step. Martha, never one to let silence linger, jumped in with her usual enthusiasm. "Mark's staying in my spare room for a while, helping me with all those projects I keep putting off. You know how I am with anything that requires actual tools." She laughed, gesturing toward her house where a loose shutter had been hanging crooked for at least 6 months. "And I'm figuring out my next steps," Mark added quietly, his words carrying weight that suggested there was much more to the story. "After a job change, and ... He paused, looking down at his boots for a moment, then back up with a slight shrug. "Other things?" He didn't elaborate, and Carol sensed he wasn't the type to share his troubles with virtual strangers. There was something private about him, like a book with its most important chapters kept carefully closed. They chatted about safe, neighborly things, the unusually warm weather they'd been having, Martha's roses that were already getting compliments from people walking by, the mischievous squirrel that had figured out how to open Carol's squirrel-proof bird feeder and was making himself fat on expensive birdseed. "That little guy's got skills," Mark said with the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. "I watched him yesterday. He hangs upside down from that wire like he's performing in the circus." Carol laughed, surprised by how natural it felt. "He's been at war with me for 3 months now. I keep buying different feeders, and he keeps proving they're not as smart as advertised." "Sounds like you've met your match," Mark said. And for a moment the weariness in his eyes lifted completely. It was pleasant conversation, the kind you have a dozen times a week with neighbors and cashiers and people you meet while walking your dog. Unremarkable in every way except for the small detail that Carol found herself paying attention to the way Mark's voice grew warmer when he talked about simple things, and how his smile seemed to surprise even him when it appeared. She went back to her quiet house, thinking he seemed like a decent person going through whatever rough patch life had handed him. Everyone had those seasons, she knew. Times when the path forward wasn't clear and you needed somewhere safe to figure out which direction to go next. A couple of days passed in the usual rhythm. Carol would see Mark occasionally through her kitchen, window mowing Martha's lawn with careful, even strokes, or tinkering around in her garage with the door open, country music playing softly in the background. They'd wave when they spotted each other, maybe call out a quick good morning or how's your day going. But he seemed content to keep to himself. She found herself noticing these small interactions more than she probably should have. The way he always waved with his whole hand, not just a finger flip. How he'd pause his work to move Martha's cat out of his path instead of working around her. Little things that spoke of someone who paid attention to the world around him. Then, one late afternoon, his golden hour was painting everything in that magical light that makes ordinary suburban streets look like movie sets. Carol was outside, watering her porch ferns. The hanging baskets were her pride and joy, cascading green curtains that made her small front porch feel like a secret garden. She was lost in the peaceful routine of checking for dry soil and deadheading spent blooms, when she heard footsteps on the walkway. Looking up, she saw Mark approaching, wiping sawdust from his hands onto his jeans. His hair was slightly mussed, and there were small wood shavings caught in his shirt, the evidence of an afternoon spent working with his hands. The setting sun was behind him, casting long shadows across both their yards and painting everything in warm honey-colored light. The air carried the sweet scent of cut grass mixed with the honeysuckle that climbed the fence between their properties. creating a perfume that spoke of summer evenings and possibilities. "Evening," he said, his voice carrying that same low, steady tone she was beginning to recognize. But there was something different about him tonight. A hesitation in his step, a way his eyes seemed to search her face as if he was trying to decide something important. He stopped a few feet away, looking down at his boots for a moment, then back up at her. In his eyes, she saw that familiar hint of weariness, but something new had joined it, a flicker of uncertainty, maybe even nervousness. He stopped a few feet away, looking down at his boots for a moment, then back up at her. In his eyes, she saw that familiar hint of weariness, but something new had joined it, a flicker of uncertainty, maybe even nervousness. "Carol, right?" he asked, though they both knew he remembered her name perfectly well. "That's right," she said, setting down her watering can and giving him her full attention. Something about his manner suggested this wasn't just a neighborly chat about the weather. "Listen," he continued, rubbing the back of his neck in a gesture that seemed both nervous and endearing. "This is going to sound, well, maybe a bit strange. But Martha mentioned something about you. She said you appreciate older things, craftsmanship, and all that." Carol raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite herself. Martha had a way of talking about everyone in the neighborhood like she was running a small-town newspaper. But she usually got the details right. "I do," Carol confirmed, curious now about where this conversation was heading. "I dabble a bit in refinishing. Small pieces mostly, things I pick up at estate sales or thrift stores. Nothing too ambitious, but I enjoy bringing old things back to life." Mark nodded slowly, like he was processing this information and trying to figure out how to use it. "Right, well, the thing is, ... He paused, gathering his thoughts while the cicadas started their evening song. That low thrumming sound that seemed to make the air itself vibrate with anticipation. "I found something in Martha's garage," he finally continued, his voice growing softer, more personal. "It belonged to my grandmother. It's an old writing desk, beautiful piece, or at least it was once. But it's seen much better days. A lot. Better days, if I'm being honest." There was something in the way he said grandmother that caught Carol's attention. Not just the word, but the weight behind it. The careful way he handled the memory like something precious and fragile. He was quiet for a moment, seeming to wrestle with how much to share. The golden light was fading now, and the first fireflies were beginning their nightly dance among Martha's rose bushes. "The thing is," he said finally, meeting her gaze directly for the first time since he'd walked over, "I need to fix it. It feels ... important. More than important, actually. It feels necessary, like something I have to do. But I've never really done anything like this before, and honestly, looking at the condition it's in, I'm completely overwhelmed." Carol found herself leaning forward slightly, drawn in by the quiet intensity in his voice. Martha's busy with her book club and her garden club and about 12 other clubs. He continued with a small smile that didn't quite hide his nervousness. "And I was wondering, just wondering, mind you, if you might consider giving me a hand or at least some advice, some pointers on where to start." He gestured vaguely toward Martha's garage, where Carol could see lights spilling out into the driveway. "I know it's a strange request, completely out of the blue. We barely know each other, and here I am asking if you'd want to spend your evenings in a dusty garage working on furniture that probably should have been thrown out years ago." His honesty was disarming, the way he laid out exactly how unusual. His request was without trying to make it sound more reasonable than it actually was. "I could really use another pair of eyes," he added quietly. "Someone who knows what they're doing and won't just tell me it's hopeless, because it's more than just a desk, you know? It's..." He trailed off, looking frustrated with his inability to put something important into words. And there it was, the unexpected request that would change everything. Not earth-shattering, not scandalous, nothing that would make headlines or shock the neighbors. Just a near stranger asking her to spend hours in a dusty garage working on his grandmother's old desk, but somehow it felt bigger than that. It felt like standing at a crossroads where the safe, familiar path continued straight ahead into more quiet evenings and predictable routines, while a smaller, less certain path branched off towards something unknown. Carol's first instinct was polite refusal. It would be so easy to make an excuse about being too busy or not having the right tools, or simply not wanting to get involved in someone else's project. The safe response, the expected response. But looking at Mark standing there in the fading golden light, looking so earnest and just a little bit lost, something made her pause. It wasn't just about the desk, she could tell that much. This was about connection, about tackling something that felt too big to handle alone, about reclaiming a piece of his own history. Maybe healing something that had been broken longer than just furniture. And if she was truly honest with herself, maybe, just maybe, she needed a little detour from her predictable life too. Her mind raced through practical considerations. Did she have the time? Did she want to get involved in what was clearly a deeply personal project? It felt intimate somehow, being asked to help restore something so connected to his family history, but his vulnerability was completely disarming. He wasn't asking for a date or money or anything complicated. Just help with a piece of wood and memories. Just someone to stand beside him while he tried to save something important. An old writing desk, she repeated, buying herself a moment to think while trying to ignore the way her heart had started beating just a little faster. What kind of wood? What kind of condition are we talking about? Mark's face brightened with relief that she hadn't immediately shut him down. Walnut, I think. Dark, rich grain underneath all the damage. Structurally sound, mostly. The bones are good, but the finish is completely shot. Scratches everywhere. Water rings, the works, and one of the drawer pulls is missing entirely. He described it with a fondness that seemed to overlook its obviously dilapidated state. The way someone might describe a beloved pet that had grown old and gray but was still precious beyond measure. My grandmother used to sit there and write. Letters, he added, his voice growing even softer. Every morning with her coffee and her fountain pen. I remember the smell of her ink mixed with the lavender sachets she kept in all the drawers. She'd let me sit beside her sometimes when I was little, show me how to hold the pen properly. That little detail, that sensory memory wrapped in such tenderness, tipped the scale completely. This wasn't just furniture. This was a vessel, holding decades of memories, a connection to someone he'd loved and lost. And he wanted to save it, to bring it back to life so those memories could live on. How could anyone say no to something like that? Mark, she heard herself saying, surprising herself with how icily the words came. I can take a look. Maybe. Offer some advice, see what we're working with. The genuine smile that broke across his face was like sunrise after a long night. It chased away the weariness and uncertainty, replacing them with something bright and hopeful that changed his entire appearance. Really? He asked, as if he couldn't quite believe she'd said yes. You'd be willing to help. Be willing to. Try, she said, feeling that flicker of anticipation growing stronger. When were you thinking of working on it? Whenever works for you, he said quickly, the words tumbling out like he was afraid she might change her mind. Evenings, weekends, I'm pretty flexible. Martha said I could use her garage as long as I need it, and I've already cleared out a space. They agreed to meet the following evening after Carol finished work. As Mark headed back toward Martha's house with a spring in his step that hadn't been there before, Carol went back inside to her quiet house, but the quiet felt different now. Not empty or lonely, but expectant, full of possibility. The predictable rhythm of her days had been interrupted by something unexpected, and she felt a flutter of excitement she hadn't experienced in longer than she cared to admit, for the first time in months. She found herself looking forward to tomorrow evening with genuine anticipation. The next day crawled by with unusual slowness. Carol found herself glancing at the clock more often than usual, watching the afternoon light change outside her office window. When 5 o'clock finally arrived, she saved her work with more enthusiasm than her spreadsheets probably deserved. She changed out of her work clothes into jeans and an old t-shirt, suitable for what promised to be dusty, hands-on work. As dusk was settling over the neighborhood like a soft blanket, she walked across the yards to Martha's garage. The garage door was open, spilling warm yellow light onto the driveway like a beacon. Inside, Mark had transformed the cluttered space into something resembling a proper workshop. Tools she didn't recognize were neatly arranged on a workbench. Sanders and scrapers, brushes and bottles of various chemicals. Cans of wood strippers sat alongside packages of sandpaper in different grits, and clean rags were folded in careful stacks. And there, positioned in the center of the cleared space, like a patient waiting for surgery, was the desk, even covered. In dust and grime, layered with the patina of years of neglect, you could see that its bones were extraordinary. The legs were elegantly carved with details that spoke of master craftsmanship. The drawers showed intricate dovetail joints that had been cut by hand, probably decades before power tools made such precision commonplace. The rich, deep grain of the walnut peeked through the scarred finish like a promise of the beauty that lay beneath. It had an air of quiet dignity about it, like an elderly relative who had seen better days but maintained their grace despite the years of wear, waiting patiently to be restored to its former glory. Mark was standing beside it, running his hand gently over the damaged surface with the tenderness someone might show a wounded animal they were determined to heal. "She's seen better days, hasn't she?" he murmured as Carol approached, his voice carrying equal parts affection and determination. "She has," Carol agreed, already moving closer to examine the piece more carefully. "But she's absolutely beautiful underneath all this damage." And she was. Carol walked slowly around the desk, her trained eye cataloging the problems while simultaneously seeing the potential. The water rings were deep and numerous, evidence of years of coffee cups and flower vases placed without coasters. The scratches told stories, some shallow, others deep enough to catch her fingernail. One corner showed the telltale marks of having been chewed, probably by a long-ago puppy who had found the walnut irresistible. The missing drawer pull left a small, lonely hole like a missing tooth in an otherwise symmetrical smile. "It's definitely salvageable," Carol said, her practical side taking over as she assessed the project ahead of them. "It's going to take work, though, a lot of patience sanding. We'll need to find a replacement pull that matches the others." Mark nodded, his expression serious but hopeful. "I figured as much, I just didn't know where to start. Or if it was even worth trying." "Oh, it's absolutely worth trying," Carol said firmly, running her own hand over the surface and feeling the solid construction beneath the damage. "This is quality craftsmanship. They don't make furniture like this anymore, and so they began." Carol showed him how to apply the chemical stripper, thick and goopy, spread evenly with an old brush that would never be good for anything else again. She explained the importance of proper ventilation, opening both the garage door and the side door to create a cross breeze that would carry away the sharp chemical fumes. "Patience is the key," she told him as they worked side by side. "Can't rush this part. The chemicals need time to work, to soften all those layers of old finish so they'll come off clean." They worked in companionable silence at first, the garage filled with the steady scrape of putty knives against wood, the crinkle of plastic sheeting, and the sharp, unmistakable smell of the stripping chemicals mixing with the warmer scents of old wood and Martha's lavender plants just outside the door. The garage was warm despite the evening air, filled with the kind of productive energy that comes from working with your hands on something that matters. And as they worked, Carol found herself stealing glances at Mark, watching the way he listened carefully to her instructions and followed them with the precision of someone who understood that good work couldn't be hurried. This was just the beginning. She knew there would be many more evenings like this one, many more hours of patient work ahead of them. But already something was different. The quiet predictability of her life had been replaced by something richer, more textured, something that felt very much like possibility. Oil and the stripper dust mows danced nth beam of the single overhead light bulb. Wasn't glamorous work. My hands get sticky. My clothes collected dusts. But there was something incredibly satisfying about peeling back the layers off old cracked varnish. Revealing the raw wood beneath Mark was a careful student watching, Kay intently asking questions, Heiserlier hesitancy replaced by focused effort. As we worked, conversations start to flow more easily. Naturally, widened talk about his job situation or whatever else had brought him here, not directly. Instead, we talked about Thedisk. He told me stories about his grandmother, a stern but loving woman, wadded him how to play chess and baked incredible apple pies. He remembered hiding under this very desk during games of hide-and-seek with his cousins. Each scrape of the knife seemed to uncover not just wood but memories I shared, a bit about my own minor restoration projects, a wobbly bookcase found on Thickherb, a picture frame picked up at a flea market we discovered, a shared appreciation for things with history, things that had been lived with and loved. He asked about my kids, and I told him about their lives, their success, their challenges. He listened intently, his gaze thoughtful. There was no pressure, no awkwardness. Just two people working towards a common goal, sharing snips of their lives in the quiet intimacy of the garage. We found Theghost of a label on the back, a furniture maker from a nearby town long since out of business. Ark looked it up on his phone. Fascinated by this link to the past, we worked until the light outside had completely faded, leaving only the low glow from the garage. My arms ached slightly from the scraping, but it was a good ache. We made some progress. Mark stayed surveying the partially stripped desk. There was a look of quiet satisfaction on his face. Couldn't have a donut without you. Carol, we're not done yet. I smiled, but it's a start. Walking back to my house under the starry sky, the usual quiet felt less like loneliness and more like peace. The rhythm of my life hadn't just been interrupted. It felt like a new quiet melody was starting to play. The following evenings fell into a comfortable pattern. After work, I'd change into old clothes and head over tough garage. Mark would usually already Bether, having prepped the space or started on a section. We discussed the night before. The initial awkwardness had completely evaporated, replaced by an easy camaraderie. The scraping and stripping phase gave way to the long meditative process of sanding, first coarse grit, then medium, then fine, smoothing away the imperfections riven. The true beauty of the walnut grain, it was repetitive work, dusty and requiring patience but oddly therapeutic. Core hands would often brush as we reached for sandpaper or steadied a drawer, small, insignificant touches, yet they built a quiet awareness between us as fell into a rhythm. Working some at times in comfortable silence, other times talking for hours, the conversation tipped. Mark started to share more about why he was here. His job had just changed, his company had downsized, and his long-held position was celebrated. It had shaken his confidence, made him question his path around Thesum time. A long-term relationship had ended, leaving him feeling adrift. Restoring his grandmother's desk felt like the one tangible thing he could control, a way to rebuild something solid and beautiful from neglect. Hearing him speak so openly with such quiet vulnerability touched me. I found myself sharing things I hadn't articulated evento myself. The subtle loneliness that had crept in after my youngest left for college. The feeling of being slightly adrift myself, wondering what the next chapter held now that the demands off raising a family had lessened. In that dusty garage, surrounded by tools and the scent of sawdust, we created a safe space. It was no judgment, only listening and understanding. We talked about regrets and hopes, about paths taken and roads not traveled. He had a dry sense of humor, thought emerged more often now, and his laughter was warm and genuine. On evening, we tackled the chewed corner. It required careful filling and sanding to make it blend seamlessly. It took both Ophis, one holding the piece steady, Theoth meticulously applying the wood filler, our heads close together as we focused on the task. I was acutely aware of his presence, the faint scent of his cologne mixed with sawdust, the warmth radiating from him. It wasn't overly romantic, but it was connected. A shared focus, a quiet intimacy built on mutual effort and burgeoning trust finding a matching drawer pull. Proved challenging, we scoured online antiquariat sites. Sending links back and forth, debating styles and finishes, it became a mini quest. I came a mini quest, a shared project within the larger one when we finally found a near perfect match on an obscure website. Mark let out a whoop of triumph, echoed in the garage, making mellow. The climax wasn't a single dramatic moment, but rather the gradual transformation of the desk itself, mirroring the subtle shifts happening within us as we applied the final coat soft tongue oil, rubbing it carefully into smoothed wood. The desk began to glow. Deep, rich colors of the walnut camel live, the grain patterns swirling. Like hidden rivers, the scars were gone or replaced by a lustrous sheen that spoke of care and attention standing. Back looking at the restored piece, a profound sense of accomplishment washed over Yuzette was beautiful, elegant, imbued. Now not just with his grandmother's history, but with the story of its restoration of the horse we'd spent side by side. Mark ran his hand over the smooth surface, its heiss expression filled with a complex mix of gratitude, pride, and perhaps a touch of sadness. That this part of the journey was over. She looks incredible. He breathed better than I ever imagined. Headed to me, his eyes meeting mine. Thank you, Carol, really, for everything in that meant. The connection between us felt palpable, a quiet acknowledgement of the unexpected bond we'd forged over sandpaper and shared stories with Thetisk finished. Gleaming under the garage light, a new kind of quiet, settled Bedouin. Thus the shared task that had brought us together was complete. Mar carefully moved the desk into Marthasia's, placing it in a spot of honor in her guest room where he was staying. Seeing it there whole and beautiful filled me with a quiet pride, but also a strange sense of melancholy. Our evenings in the garage were over. We stewed awkwardly in Martha's hallway for a moment, while Mark said, breaking Thieselins, "Guess that's it. It turned out beautifully." I replied, meaning more thanj. The desk, thanks again, Carol, for your time, your expertise, your company. Has smiled that genuine smile. That reach at his eyes, it meant a lot. I thought that might be the end of it. We'd go back tobing neighbors, acquaintances who waved across the lawn. The detour was over, the predictable rhythm would resume, but then next evening Mark knocked on my door, held 2 mugs in his hands. "Martha Medica Mommal tea," he said. "Thought you mighta like some. We could sit on the porch." Wes sat on my porch swing as twilight tea-panned. The air cool and sweet. We didn't talk about the desk instead. Wet tacked about the future. Mark had started applying for jobs, feeling more optimistic than he had in months. He wasn't sure where he'd land, but the sense of drift seemed to have lessened. Felt more grounded, he said, more hopeful. He attributed much of that shift to the process of restoring the desk, the focus. It gave him the sense of accomplishment, but he also looked at me. He said it, implying my presence had been part of that grounding too. I spoke about my own tentative plans, maybe to Kingen, online course perhaps, volunteering at local library. Small steps towards reading my next chapter. Sharing thesanant ideas with him felt natural. Easy sitting there, sipping tea in the comfortable silence, I realized how much I had gained from this unexpected encore. It wasn't just about helping him. It was about allowing myself to connect, to step outside my routine, to share vulnerability, and accept it. In Reader Note, it reminded me that connection can come in unexpected forms. That meaning can be found in shared task shower. Simple, it chipped away at the quiet loneliness I hadn't fully acknowledged, replacing it with a sense of quiet companionship and possibility. Mark eventually found a promising job prospect in another state. His stay at Martha's drew to a close. There was no dramatic farewell, just a heartfelt Hugin. Martha's driveway before he left. "Keep in touch?" he asked. "Definitely, I promise, Dan. We have emails, occasional phone calls, sharing updates on our lives." The connection forged in that dusty, garagey to vanish. It simply adapted to distance, sometimes when my house feels too quiet. I think about those evenings, scent of sawdust, The scrape off sandpaper, the low murmur of conversation through the single light. Bulb, I think about the unexpected gift of Mark's request, how saying yes to helping a neighbor's cousin restore an old discended up restoring something in me twat wasn't a whirlwind romance or a leffel touring adventure in the traditional sense. It was something quicker, deeper, a shared human experience. I thought reminded me of the beauty of connection, the satisfaction of patient work, and the quiet joy of discovering that even a predictable rhythm can will come a new harmonious melody. My life is still relatively quiet, but it doesn't feel empty. It feels full of potential open. 2. The small, unexpected produce need for connection that make life truly rich, and it all started Bez, my neighbor's cousin, asked me to join him. You really wouldn't believe what happened. Not a dramatic story perhaps, but a meaningful,